Sometimes I think more recently we call it mercenary spyware. Basically this is malicious software used by police and intelligence around the world, and usually developed by government contractors in Western countries. So maybe let's start with you, Bill. Can you talk to us about one of the most significant investigations you've done recently and what that teaches us about this problem?
Good question. Well, so a lot of the work that we do at Citizen Lab is focused on companies, some of which you may have heard of. NSO Group is an example, a company based in Israel that sells these sorts of very sophisticated spyware products to governments, many of them perhaps less on the democratic side or more on the authoritarian side. The products are often used to target journalists, dissidents, human rights activists. A particularly interesting case recently was a couple of years ago, we were checking the phone of a human rights activist based in Saudi Arabia, and when we checked her phone, one of the interesting things we noticed, aside from the fact that there had been malicious processes that we were able to link to innocent spyware running on her phone, is we were able to capture a little bit of the vector, the exploit that facilitated the installation of the spyware. And what was really interesting about it is it was what's called a zero-click exploit, meaning that Regine didn't have to do anything. She was just sitting in front of her phone. 1 minute it was secure, the next it was hacked.
And Maricha, can you tell us a little bit about the work you did as a parliament member in the EU about this topic?
Yeah, so whenever we talk about spyware today, I'm sort of shocked and I feel very old that this has been a topic I've been working on for 12 years. And we still haven't solved it. So I think the idea that while governments in the EU, from this side of the world, the US, but also other democratic governments are, protecting the freedom of assembly, supporting human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of the press with their statements. For example, when I first encountered this technology around the Arab uprisings, you have these governments all supporting universal human rights, and then you have companies from, as you mentioned, democratic countries based in democratic countries selling the very technologies that are the key tool in the toolbox of repression of authoritarian regimes. What we've learned over the years is that it's not only authoritarian regimes that are using spyware, and I think the word is commercial spyware because this is stuff that also, a mafia boss or some cartel leader can buy. It's not exclusive to government, so this is really concerning as a type of proliferation of technology that's ready for sale for anyone who wants to buy it. But essentially, we initially thought of the use of hacking tools and spyware as something that indeed neatly divided authoritarian governments from the democratic ones. But now we also see case after case, for example, in the EU today, where Poland, Hungary, Spain, Greece, just to name a few, state authorities have used these commercial spyware tools to hack the devices of journalists, judges, critical opposition leaders. And so really, even if these tools are sold as counterterrorism measures, crime fighting tools, they're really also tools for repression, and they undermine very directly the credibility of democratic governments to speak about human rights at all. And this is really important.
And I'm curious, have you ever been targeted with spyware during your work?
Not that I know of, but that doesn't mean anything, because as Bill said, it could be that it already crawled into my devices without me knowing, but I've never experienced the consequences. And maybe that's also because, as an elected official from a democratic country, you do have privilege in some ways, right? I mean, if you look at activists from the Middle East, for example, that Citizen Lab has also extensively researched not only Jane, who is very courageous as a human rights activist in Saudi Arabia, but also others who've worked all over the world. A lot of them, don't have as much agency. They're already in a vulnerable position for speaking truth to power, for engaging in human rights work that may be illegal in these societies. And then on top of that, they become vulnerable. We've seen with Khadija Eshmailova, for example, in Azerbaijan, a very courageous journalist who had the way in which the hacking of people's devices, the way in which spyware can be used against people, can be devastating. And compared to the work of activists, I've always been in a position of privilege as an elected member.
And you actually anticipated what I wanted to ask. I think for years we all thought that this was a problem mostly of Western countries and Western companies based in Western countries selling to authoritarian regimes. But as you said, we now see cases in Spain, Hungary, Poland, Greece. So, Bill, how has this changed? First of all, were you surprised? Because you've been researching this like one of the first people for like 12 years. Were you surprised to see that actually this was happening also, in Western countries, and how has that changed the world and perception of
Well, certainly, from the very early time I was researching spyware, one of the things we were able to do is, once we identify a single spyware attack, we can attribute the spyware to a company, we can often do a process of what we call internet scanning, where we fingerprint the mechanism by which the information is exfiltrated by the spyware to the community control server, as it's called. So this is something that server. We can fingerprint it, scan the internet. So from one attack, let's say the Middle East, we can get a fairly good sense of the other servers involved, and if it's a company selling the spyware, those could be from other customers. And then we can ask further research questions to try and attribute those servers to specific other governments. So pretty early on, we were able to understand, okay, well, yeah, there are Western governments that are using these products. But of course, when you find the server, the next question is, well, who is being spied on? We can see maybe, some Western government is using this spyware, but who are the targets? And you might say, okay, well, we expect that, well, if it's the police in some European country, well, they're probably spying on criminals or terrorists, right? Like that's the sort of natural, you don't immediately think like, oh, they're spying on the political opposition, right? It doesn't really cross your mind because there's often not, if you look at you follow very closely the local landscape, the local political landscape in these countries, yeah, you might sort of get some clues like, oh, the government's, trying to intimidate opposition candidates, or they're charged with being brought against specific journalists, and they think, okay, well, there's some light level harassment of the opposition journalists. But it was quite surprising to see this, pretty aggressive hacking, like the cases in Poland where lawyers were hacked dozens of times in a very short time period, indicating that the government was very interested in continuous monitoring of their communications.
Yeah, perhaps we were a little bit naive and had too much confidence in our own institutions. And speaking of institutions, as a lawmaker, what have been the biggest challenges trying to regulate this industry, spyware industry?
I think strangely political will. So there is a perverse relation, which you can already gather from the initial comments that we've been making between governments and this market, and the willingness to cut off some of these tools, because we all know that very sophisticated intelligence services, maybe the ones in this country, don't need commercial hacking tools or spyware to be able to gain access to the devices of people that they're interested in. But I do think it's safe to assume that the Polish government may have never had these capabilities had it not been for NSO Group, or the Hungarian government, or another government for that matter. So for some of these state agencies, access to this capability is a sort of crucial pipeline for them to have the capabilities that they do. And combined with that, I think oftentimes police, intelligence services are at risk of having a bit of tunnel vision. They are spending 24/7 going after that terrible terror suspect, that crime ringleader that they've been hunting for years. And I understand, I think this is painstaking work, and I don't want to diminish its importance. But what we're talking about here is the proliferation of these technologies, the fact that they slip out of the hands of these, very narrow context, rule of law clad, specific use cases, but that instead, and this has been acknowledged by experts in the national security agencies, very agencies and the very goals of the state, for example, to keep the state democratic and secure. And there's been a lack of appreciation that the harms of this market are actually more significant than the benefits, if you want to look at it sort of in those terms. And so when I was working on regulation in the European Union, it was probably one of the hardest things to move. It just took forever, and I couldn't really understand, because to me, until this day, I think it is entirely logical to want to ban anti-democratic, human rights violating technologies. That's what these technologies are. So I think the legitimate use cases do not weigh up against the harmful use cases anymore, and that governments in democracy should really ask themselves, do they want to continue to facilitate this market and the proliferation of these tools therefore? It was very, very hard to get any change done through regulation, and it's probably because governments were pushing back. Ultimately, though, and I hope we'll get to talk about this, the United States has recently adopted a new executive order in a way that gets closer to addressing some of these perverse mechanisms between the market, the proliferation, and the role of government. We can talk about that.
So do you think that ideally right now maybe the best thing to do is ban the use of these tools completely?
I think it should definitely be on the table. And especially, and that's perhaps why it's not so surprising that the US government has been willing to say the US government will no longer be allowed to use commercial spyware anymore, which is the recent executive order that I'm referencing, because they have plenty of government capabilities. They don't need these commercial tools. For other governments, like I mentioned, some of the ones in Europe, this would be a different case altogether. And so, I personally think it's a very toxic market. I've tried to rein it in for a long, long time as a lawmaker, and it's still a topic very close to my heart. One thing that I don't work as much on a day-to-day basis like Bill does with Citizen Lab, which it should be said is a groundbreaking work, is really done crucial investigations, courageously so, to shed light on this very dark, nasty industry that doesn't really like the criticism that it's getting, and so it has become sort of an activist thing to do, to even shed light on these tools and the companies and the investors behind them.
Yeah, you did a lot of work on trying to regulate the export of these technologies. I mean, looking back, do you think that given the proliferation of spyware, do you think that trying to limit export was the right approach, or was it flawed? Was it still worth it? What do you think about that?
So we never thought that restricting the export would be the only thing, but the interesting thing is when you look at policy tools, that they're often fragmented. So if you look at what the EU did, we tried to limit the sale of these technologies to countries with no human rights violation track records. Fast forward to what the US government did this year, they looked at their own behavior, saying the US government should use these commercial spyware tools anymore. And so, in a strange way, there are mirror images of the problem. The use and the export. And then a third, you could say the import, because in the case of many EU governments, they import from Israel. Israel is really a leading market here, with NSO Group and many other companies in the same spirit. Many founders of these companies come directly from Israeli intelligence services, who also have great capabilities in this sense. And so, if you look at the multiple dimensions of how these technologies create harm, I think it would have been better if we could have addressed the industry in one go in the European Union, import, use, and export. But there was no policy tool, policy space to capture all of it at once. Plus, at the time, and I realize how naive this may sound now, but really at the time, it seemed more of a problem of abuse by authoritarian regimes rather than the fact that this proliferation was already going on so much. And so what we could do as Europeans is tackle European companies, of which we of course knew they were not the only ones. We knew there were companies in the Middle East, we knew that there would be new ones coming in the future, but when you're a European lawmaker, your jurisdiction is the EU, and so I had to work within the limitations that that jurisdiction and the policy tools created.
And Bill, obviously you're a technologist. Have you seen any changes because of regulation in the last few years? From your visibility to the market, has regulation made any difference?
Well, yeah, I think so. So it's one of the major developments in the regulatory space somewhat recently. A couple of years ago, the United States Commerce Department added NSO Group, and then more recently, I think earlier this year, another entity, Intellexa, to essentially a list of specially designated entities, which the first order impacts of that are not super important. The main sort of signaling, or the main sort of second order impact is signaling to potential investors, to other governments, to Israel, where NSO is based. Hey, we're not happy about this. Like this can't keep going all the way it's going. And in response, what Israel did is Israel said, okay, well, the Americans are mad at us. We want to placate the Biden administration. So we're going to reduce the list of countries to which will automatically grant licenses for export, and we're also going to more carefully police this stuff. And that does seem to have had an effect. We've seen reporting out of Israel that a number of companies that were hoping to hawk their spyware in some anti-democratic countries in Africa, for instance, were not able to complete their sales, and thus some revenue hits, some went out of business. We haven't seen any substantial new proliferation of, for instance, Pegasus since that action was taken by Israel. So it sort of does demonstrate that these regulations on export can have effects. But again, what you would probably sort of hope to happen is that, well, there would be some sort of panel that would review these exports and take into account human rights rather than just, the Americans are angry at us, we need to address that problem, right? However, on the other hand, we've seen some of the slack left by Israel being picked up by companies that export from places like Cyprus or other jurisdictions. So we've seen companies like Intellexa and Citrox, which can export from outside of Israel, selling to some of the places that maybe the Israelis don't plan to sell.
Yeah, and we're speaking about the U.S. government. Something I learned last week is that Congress introduced a law called the Protecting Americans from Foreign Commercial Spyware Act. One of the goals of the law is to prevent the U.S. government from giving assistance to governments that have a track record of using mercenary spyware. Question to both of you: do you think this is the right approach? Can this make a difference?
Yeah, I think it can make a difference. It sort of puts another tool in the hands of the executive branch that they can use to tackle this problem. So, my view of it is it's a good step, but it also does require the occupant of the White House to be, committed to and interested in enforcing this provision.
What do you think?
Well, I take a slightly different perspective. Of course, I think every step taken to curb this market is necessary and helpful. But did we really need American devices to be hacked to appreciate how problematic this market was? It also underlines for me that there is, especially in this country, often a view that if it doesn't touch other people, it's not a problem. Whereas I think this is typically a global problem, and the writings have been on the wall for over a decade, and so, great. But a more principled global approach would also be extremely helpful in this case, and not only the few, and I'm very sorry that it happened to them, but like diplomats that worked in third countries through whose hacked devices this came to light. And maybe adding to a couple of examples that we've mentioned, it's very hard to know still who all are and have successfully been targeted. It's very incidental, and it's because of the work of Citizen Lab, but also investigative journalists, so all the credit to them. The Pegasus papers were another important sign, let's say, of accountability that really sped up the discussion about why this market, this technology is so harmful, because it turned out that because of leaked documents that presumably, the editor-in-chief of the Financial Times, President Macron of France, were all targets of this technology. And so I want to come back to this sort of perception of why this is a problem. And unfortunately, the harms to human rights defenders in the Middle East were never taken seriously enough. It had to first target Americans, then hotshot names that people understand, but that we clearly know that, for example, President Macron is not a terrorist suspect or a crime suspect, or that the editor-in-chief of one of the biggest publications, is doing journalistic work and is not sought by law enforcement. And so I think we will learn more, frankly, of the harms of these tools, and we should be particularly concerned of the innovative capabilities and the new companies that we will see springing up in parts of the world that have absolutely zero appetite to regulate these companies. So yes, great, good to have a line in the sand, US government finally taking action. But I'm also worried about what more we will see from parts of the world that don't care about human rights, that don't care about curbing their own industries, but that do really like to see more and more capabilities that can be used for surveillance and control.
Yeah, as you mentioned, the U.S. uses similar tools. They develop similar tools, both internally in intelligence agencies and with some commercial producers. So, can we rely on the U.S. or any one country to sort of like police this industry?
No. But we do live in a world where getting any kind of global agreement on any kind of topic is incredibly difficult. So I would suggest that democratic, rule of law-based societies owe it to themselves and to their own credibility to tackle these principally violating technologies. And then from there, they can try to, through multilateral organizations and bilateral agreements, come to a growing set of countries that agree. But I have no illusions about how easy it is to get some kind of handshake at the United Nations about this topic, even if I care about it.
Speaking of the U.S., Bill, recently, as we've said, Spyware has been used inside the U.S. And recently, you and your colleagues discovered an exploit called LastPass, and you said that it was used against an individual employed by a Washington D.C.-based civil society organization. What can you tell us about this case?
Yeah, so this was another really interesting case of this sort of quote-unquote zero-click hacking capability, right, where someone's phone can be hacked without them taking any action. Like, I think people sort of intuitively grasp the fact, oh, well, a hacker can convince me to download like a dodgy program or install something that's malicious, or, type in my password, and they have my password, and can steal my emails and things like that. But it's a little bit trickier for many people to conceive of the fact that really your phone is doing a ton of stuff in the background. Like, it's constantly receiving messages, displaying notifications, rendering images to show you on your lock screen, things like this. There's a lot of code that's running in the background, processing messages from the internet. And in this case, the specific vulnerability we were able to identify resulted from a failed attempt to hack this person's device. And because the attempt failed, the remnants of this zero-click exploit were left over on the phone. And in this case, what it was the root of the vulnerability was a bug in Google's WebP image library, which is integrated into the iPhone. And the attackers found some way to exploit this bug to run arbitrary code within Apple's blast door iMessage sandbox, which is supposed to, prevent these sorts of bugs from, affecting the whole system. But then the attackers also found some way to break outside of Apple's sandbox and install a spyware in the system. So this was a pretty interesting find. Whenever you get something like this, and are able to disclose it to Apple and release an update, it's kind of a big deal because it sets the attackers back. They have to, invest a considerable amount of time, energy, and money in identifying new weaknesses that they can exploit. And once people install the update, they're immune to this particular hack. So it's important, I think, to look out for and discover this stuff. And it turned out to be from a technical perspective, quite an exciting case. And there was certainly some buzz, as you pointed out, due to the fact that this is a DC-based NGO, which sort of, again, from the perspective of the US government, US regulators raises that spectrum. This problem, we've allowed, hopefully what people are thinking is, oh, we've allowed this to fester for too long, it's now coming home and affecting the US, we should do something about that.
Yeah, and speaking of doing something about it, you were a lawmaker, now you can look at it from the outside. What's the ideal here? What are the regulations that you would implement or suggest our colleagues in the EU Parliament or US Congress and other countries to implement?
Yeah, so it depends on whether there's any kind of regulation in place already or whether there is not. But I think one, there should be restrictions, if not bans, on the use of commercial spyware by democratic governments. I think the US's executive order really sets a good example there because it also chokes off the procurement market for these companies, and it decreases the credibility that they get from supplying to U.S. state agencies. You see oftentimes with these companies that they say, we also sell to the American police, so we're actually a very legitimate actor. It helps marketing. In the EU, there are a couple of more detailed things that I think would be most helpful. I mean, one, I also think, to add to the US case, it's great that the government can't use it anymore. It doesn't mean that no one in the US can use it anymore. If there is someone who has the resources and wants to use commercial spyware in the United States, they can. So they can still use it to go after civil society groups or journalists, as long as they can get their hands on it and they're not the US government. So that still leaves quite significant use cases wide open. So I think that's something that the US could tackle going forward. The exports would also be a useful thing to tackle, just to close the loop. In the EU, there are obvious priorities to take. One is to have a standard of non-use for governments themselves, so that would also mean no imports, for example, such as from Israel. But the oversight should be better. In the EU at the moment, it is national authorities oversee national license applications, and I think the relationship between national companies that may want to get a license to export and the national authorities can be too close. So I would prefer to have EU level oversight, so there's one level of abstraction, and so hopefully more independence when the oversight happens. And then ideally this would become an international normal way, for example, banning the death penalty, which unfortunately this country still hasn't done, but most democratic countries have done, to become a norm that is actually no longer being discussed, that actually democratic countries, rule of law-based countries have a certain threshold of how they regulate their own behavior and thereby try to influence the behavior of others. And so I would hope that this becomes something that is sort of integral to what it means to be a rule of law-based democratic society.
And speaking of tech, we're close to time, so Bill, what do you think, are there any tech changes that can improve the situation? The regulation, what can Apple do and other tech companies do to protect their users?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's a tension on the tech side of things, right? Companies want to make their devices extremely easy to use. They want to reduce friction around communication and messaging. And those are all good goals, but on the other hand, it enables these messaging apps to be used as a vector of exploitation. We've seen positive steps from Apple in terms of introducing their lockdown mode feature, which currently is an optional feature that you have to turn on. It's disabled by default, but it disables a lot of this automatic processing of message content from people that aren't your friends, right? People not on your phone or your contact list. So I think more steps like that reduce the attack surface. So thinking about ways to prevent things from automatically happening, to sort of slow things down. I mean, it's sort of antithetical, right, to the way a lot of technology is done, but that's, I think, one key thing that can improve security.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for listening.